Hello, my name is Floyd Red Crow Westerman. I'm of the Dakota Sioux Nation. It is my honor to present segments from the first installment of an important new docu-series called America's War on Indian Nations. What happened to the indigenous peoples of this country is much like the Jewish Holocaust. Only America's ethnic cleansing was at the hands of people who would later claim innocence in the name of God, freedom, and democracy. Historians have been reluctant to use the word Holocaust to describe the taking of the land and the shaping of America. Instead, they use rhetoric like the new frontier, or claim that the Indians were savage after all, or describe it as manifest destiny. Manifest destiny means that the taking of the land was not only justified, but ordained by God. Most schools in America still teach this feel-good version of history. America's War on Indian Nations tells another side of the story. This series will tell the truth about gross injustices and rampant human rights violations inflicted upon an entire culture. Early-day Europeans who came to America were commissioned to look for gold. With gold, the objective meant that nothing would stand in their way. State by state, various tools of genocide were employed in what became a systematic clearing of the land. The first of these tools was the bullet. The bullet was used to kill many millions of my people. Another tool of genocide was the smallpox-infected blanket. To Indians, the blanket was a dominant trade item. To give a blanket was a gesture of respect. Knowing this, early Americans distributed smallpox blankets in order to exterminate and eradicate the existing population. Those who survived this early form of biological warfare were removed by organized government-funded militias and more bullets. Imagine being in your home having dinner with your family when suddenly armed intruders break in and shoot your parents, take your children, burn your house, the children to be later used as servants and sex slaves. And if you survive that, to be rounded up like cattle and put on death marches to remote locations far from your homeland and put on reservations, a nicer term for what they really were, concentration camps. This horrific scenario is what happened to thousands and thousands, if not millions, of Indian people. For my ancestors, the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, this policy of concentration camp lifestyle was in effect from 1890 to 1930. For 40 years, my people were prohibited by law from leaving the reservations. The ethnic cleansing was effective. It is estimated that when Columbus arrived, there were approximately 20 million Indians in America. By the end of World War II, only 500,000 remained. This means that complete extermination was nearly accomplished. Listen to the words of some of the founding fathers of this country. George Washington, revered as the father of this country, wrote, and I quote, "Indians were wolves and beasts who deserved nothing from the whites but total ruin." Thomas Jefferson, acclaimed proponent of freedom and democracy, argued that the United States government was obliged, and I quote, "to pursue Indians to extermination or to drive them to new seats beyond our reach." Andrew Jackson, founder of the modern Democratic Party and the greatest Indian killer of all American presidents, urged United States troops, and I quote, "to rout out from their dens and kill Indian women and their whelps." It is a great irony that American Indians, after being denied for many years their right to practice their own religion, speak their own languages, after being forced to live in the oppressive concentration camp lifestyles, After all that, Indians have gone on to become staunch defenders of this country in times of need. More Indians have received the Congressional Medal of Honor per capita than any other group of people. We remain a proud people in spite of the efforts to exterminate us. In order to heal, we first must accept our past. And now excerpts from Part 1, Exterminate Them, the California Story. In 1851, the first governor of California, Peter Burnett, wrote in a subsequent inaugural speech that a war of extermination will be waged between the two races until the Indian race becomes extinct. And in 1850, the first legislature of California enacted a law under the guise of protecting Indians titled An Act for the Government and Protection of Indians. In Section 20 of the law, it defined vagrant Indians and prescribed their punishment. It stated that any Indian able to work and support himself, who shall be found loitering and strolling about or frequenting public places, shall be liable to be arrested on the complaint of any resident citizen of the county. For, and I quote, champions of the Christian faith to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ wheresoever placed, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. The following is a story of what happened in California.
Right after the conquest of the Valley of Mexico, a debate erupted whether Indians were human beings or not. Philosophers and scholars in Spain argued that they were natural-born slaves, not capable of understanding the complexities of Catholicism and Christianity.
See, Spain based their ownership and the right to do this on something called a papal bull of 1493, the year after Columbus discovered the New World for Europe. The Pope said, okay, Spain gets to have North America and part of South America, and Portugal gets the rest. So, by the swipe of a pen, we have a Pope giving away our property.
When they entered here, I think it was the beginning of the end of the Cahuilla people here as far as our culture went, because everything was destroyed by them. When they brought cattle in here, thousands of cattle and horses and things, and they destroyed the very food that was for the Indian people. This is never written anywhere. There's never told how they suffered in their own land.
But probably the most devastating was the introduced diseases. And we're talking about children's diseases like measles, mumps, chickenpox, not even to mention the horrendous ones like smallpox and diphtheria, venereal diseases. And people became afraid. Their children were sick and dying. In all epidemic diseases, it is the children and the elders who die first. Sadly, kind of a situation where your past and your future are dying right before your eyes.
In the spring of 1769, Father Junipero Serra, accompanied by the Spanish military, sailed into San Diego Harbor and established California's first mission. Over the next 50 years, the Spaniards built 20 other missions along the coast to colonize the land and pacify the Indians. When Father Serra arrived, there were approximately 340,000 Indians in California. By the turn of the century, only 17,000 remained.
And then when they started the missions here, well, that was worse yet, because they were all Indian slaves that built those missions. And I remember my father was telling me one time, he said, you know, his great-great-uncle and his uncle before that, his great-great-uncle was telling them that he was one that was kidnapped and taken into one of the missions.
They went to church every day. They had routines of prayers and labor every day. And Floyd, remember this, most of these Indians could not speak Spanish. The Mass is delivered in Latin. At several missions, explorers came by and reported, English and French explorers reported that the Indians are made to kneel on the tiles. There was no benches. They're made to kneel on the tiles and remain motionless during the entire Mass, by the way, with armed guards with fixed bayonets at the corner. This is not the image that we have of the missions that you go to visit today.
Forced to listen, forced to be there.
They had no choice. They had no choice, and they would be punished if they did not go there. If they ran off, they were not allowed to run off.
And I don't know how, by luck, he got a run away from there again and went home. And he said, you know what they are doing to our people? And the people were wondering, and he said, they made us do this, and he would kneel down, and if we didn't do that, they'd whip us, then you had to become that, or otherwise you're going to be killed. And we had to make that with the cross. He didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know anything about it. Then they were whipped, and they were not given any food. They had to be hungry all the time. He said, that's what they're doing to my people over there.
There have been very careful studies done of the Spanish records, looking at the kind of food that the Indians were being given, and calculating the number of calories per day that they were probably receiving. On average, it's less than 1,000 calories a day. In many missions, the numbers they figured somewhere between 600 and 700 calories per day. Let me put this in some context. On slave plantations in the South, the field slaves working in the fields were getting, according to contemporary analyses, approximately 4,000 to 4,500 calories a day. Now, that's a lot of calories. But it's a lot of calories because you're working like a slave. You need that kind of caloric intake in order to do slave labor. Mm-hmm. The Indians were doing slave labor also, but they're getting 600 and 700, maybe 1,000 calories a day.
It's a big difference.
It's a huge difference. They're starving to death. They're working them to death and starving them to death. Make another comparison. In the final year or so of the Buchenwald concentration camp in Nazi Germany, there again have been calculations of the amount of caloric intake that the inmates received. It was around 600 to 700 calories a day. That's, I can't remember exactly, something like a cup of milk and a little and a piece of bread or something. That is what the people in the missions were getting year after year after year, decade after decade after decade. They were literally being starved.
But I think it's important also, Floyd, that we acknowledge that these Indians weren't just victims, as they responded in numerous ways. The very first mission here in San Diego was attacked within the first 2 weeks of the arrival of the Spanish, and in 1775 a force of nearly 1,200 local Kumeyaay Indians sacked and burned Mission San Diego. They didn't have a convert here for 2 years.
Having survived the Spanish onslaught, the worst was yet to come. In 1848, gold was discovered in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. Settlers and immigrants flooded into the region from the east. For the second time in less than a century, California Indians encountered a people who claimed to have divine right to their land. This time, the resulting genocide was in the name of manifest destiny.
In the process of searching for this gold, the attitude for the Native people at that time was honed to precision. And that was the mentality of nits make lice. The only good Indian is a dead Indian. And this thing standing between America and progress had to be erased somehow.
They went all over California, from the Siskiyou Alps all the way south into the Cuyamacas here in San Diego County. They worked everywhere, and they disrupted Indian lives everywhere they went. It was an entirely lawless situation. Floyd, there was undescribable violence towards the Indian people. Indian children were stolen, little girls were made into sex slaves, little boys into servants, parents were murdered, Indian villages were burnt down, principally at the hands of militias. These militias were just organized gangs of killers that went out without any legal authority.
Even the military at times couldn't stand the assault of the vigilantes on the Native people, and sometimes they'd stop that, but very often, and too often, they'd turn the other way.
And it was like that all over, even up in Northern California. They would give them poisoned roast cattle and things, and the Indian people just died left and right. They hunted their heads. They paid so much for Indian head, $50 to $10, whatever. They were all, you always had to bring in the head of the Indian that you killed. That's what they did to the people here in California.
This went on for the first 2 years of the gold rush at such an intense pace that 100,000 Indians died in the first 2 years of the gold rush. Floyd, nothing like this happened anywhere else in North America. Nothing like this was comparable to the loss of life and the utter chaos and violence of the gold rush.
If that's what was perpetrated by civilians, it's very much like ethnic cleansing at its height in this country.
It's one of the uglier chapters of ethnic cleansing in North American Indian history, and probably stands in world history as an outstanding example of the cruelty of human beings to one another.
When gold played out, the slaughter continued as attention shifted to ownership of the land. Echoing the sentiment of the public, the press called for the extermination of the red man.
When the military and the volunteers, the guards and the Pitt River Rangers, they had several different names for the people in California who organized on their own to go out and basically kill Indians and help the military clear the land.
One of the most disturbing things that I ever came across in the documentation was the inaugural address of California's first governor, when he declared that a war of extermination would be made against the Indians until the Indian race is extinct. We've got a classic example of the head of a modern state endorsing genocide.
Sometimes when we hear the word Stanford, we think, boy, that's the best university there ever was, and it may be. But when Leland Stanford was the governor of California, the militia out there killing Native people, they got paid in rifle, powder, and ball for killing Indians. That was their reward.
The militias were financed at first by local merchants who simply saw an advantage of getting rid of the local Indians. Then they would submit the bill to the state legislature. Since the state legislature had barely formed, and they were clamoring for protection against Indian depredations, as they called it, the state legislature paid them back and then sent the bill to the federal government. And the federal government reimbursed, eventually, over $1.5 million for militia campaigns against Indians. Now, the great tragedy in this is that this becomes a form of subsidized murder.
The townspeople of Eureka decided that they wanted to take it. And one night, February 26, 1860, they came quietly, silently. They left their guns at home, and they brought clubs and hatchets. They came while they were sleeping, and the men were gone, and they killed the women and children and the elders. So the island is bloody, and there was a baby found on that island in 1860, the morning of, after the massacre took place, and that baby was Jerry James, and he was my great-great-grandfather.
It was public policy to take my scalp. It was public policy to take my ear. Public policy to even take my head and sell it to California's government for $5. We're standing at this rock here where it says Bloody Island, scene of a battle between the U.S. soldiers under command of Captain Lyons and Indians under Chief Augustine. This battle that they're calling was actually a massacre of our people here on Napati. And it started with these two men from the Sonoma area called Charles Stone and Andrew Kelsey. They bought some land from Vallejo, General Vallejo, and came up here and brought their cows and settled in the area over there by Canuptai, the town that they call Kelseyville now. They treated the Indians real bad. They would enslave them. They made them build fences around their own village so they couldn't go hunting or gathering. And they wanted complete control. They would tell the parents to bring your little girls to our house, Stone and Kelsey. And the parents would, and if they refused, they would get hung in a tree and they would get whipped and left there all night for punishment. They were treated so bad and starving that they went and killed Charles Stone and Andrew Kelsey. And for killing them, Ben Kelsey heard about it, and he got 15 vigilantes together, which one of the vigilantes was the governor of California, William Boggs. There was lawyers, there were businessmen. I mean, it was just, regular citizens got together and they came over here just to kill and revenge what happened to Andrew Kelsey and Charles Stone.
One of the few survivors of this massacre was Lucy Moore, the great-grandmother of Clayton Duncan.
The reason why she survived was because of a game that the kids played around here in the Tulies, a hide-and-go-seek game. They would take a reed and they would hide under the water and breathe through this reed while, they would be hiding. And it was kind of hard to, find a little brown kid in a bunch of Tulies, breathing through the reed under the water. And so she knew that game. And when this battle happened, when this butchering happened, well, that's what she done. She took this reed. Her mother told her to get a reed. She got under the water and she started breathing through the reed, and that's how she survived.
Many of the people who survived were forced onto reservations or sold into slavery to provide free labor in the mines and on the ranches. Over 4,000 children were bought and sold at markets at prices ranging from $60 for a boy to $200 for a girl. Enslaved women and girls were sold for higher prices because the miners and ranchers used them for forced sexual labor.
The California state government paid $1 million for scalping missions in 1851 and 1852. Militias were paid $5 for a severed Indian head in Shasta in 1855, and 25 cents for a scalp in Honey Lake in 1863.
One of the things that my father always talked to me about was when most of the Cahuilla people were almost destroyed completely here, when Chief Juan Antonio protected the non-Indians and fought for them, and he realized that we would never defeat the white man that was coming in. He realized that, and he didn't want his people to die. And then he helped those people and protected them. In turn, the army sent in infected smallpox blankets, and he killed about 60% of the Cahuilla people at that time.
The other records, and where would
Yes, this is one of the things. I belong to the Riverside Historical Society, and after I got out of there, my brother took place, and my brother and I and my family still speak the language, and he took over and he found out what happened. They said, this is what they did to Juan Antonio and all of my people, and they said, oh no, that has to be documented before we can really put it out. So they went and looked over it, and they got in Washington, it is documented that they did send the blankets here, the army blankets, to the people here.
Was there the documented in form of letters, military records? I think
so, yes.
They
went through that, and that's why they have that plaque now right there by the rest area to Juan Antonio, and then my brother put that up with the help of all the people that belong to that historical society in Riverside. We
You asked me about what kind of people could do the kinds of things we've talked about that the Europeans did to the indigenous people. It boggles the mind to think of the psychopathology that can go into this kind of thing. But what clearly happens in these situations is an ideology has been created that these individuals work within that says that those people are less than human. When I was in graduate school, I was a classmate with a man who was on leave from the United States Navy. He was the most high-ranking African-American in the United States Navy. He was a captain, then he became an admiral. And he and I used to talk about the Pequot War, because he was writing on the Pequot War. And he got very emotional, talking about what the Puritans had done to the Indians and how they had dehumanized them in order to kill them, because, he said, that's what he had done. As a naval officer in Vietnam, commanding a fleet of ships that were shelling villages all up and down the coast of Vietnam, not knowing who they're killing. They're killing babies, they're killing women, they're killing old people, they're killing civilians. They don't care. He doesn't care. He said, I never even thought about their lives because they were just gooks. They were just dehumanized things. If I'd ever could have seen what I was doing and thought of them as human beings, I couldn't live with myself for it. But I had been trained to dehumanize them, and so I did. And that's exactly what happens over and over again. It's what's happening in Kosovo, it's what's happened in Cambodia, it happened in Rwanda, it happened in Nazi Germany, and it happened here in California and across the whole continent.
And it wasn't just the native people who were being really annihilated in some of this. You know, claim jumpers, you shoot a claim jumper. So that happened a lot in the gold area. Sometimes the white people would be killing white people. If somebody just walked on their land, they claimed. So there was a lot of other killing going on too. So killing was terrible. One ploy, one thing that they would do to, I don't know, make them feel better or something, was if some new person, for instance, would move in or near Round Valley, American, they may go over and burn his house down. And then they leave bows and arrows there, which is the indication that the Indians attacked this settler, which gave them better excuse to go down the reservation and just start killing. Killing is somehow a disease, I think. If you start killing, maybe you can't stop. You know, like a dog starts killing chicken. I don't think you can stop that dog from killing chickens anymore. You've got to do something to the dog or get rid of the chicken. But basically, I think that thing gets in human beings, too. A very evil spirit invades, becomes paramount. It takes over.
One of the deal about the government, too, to send all the children away to government schools so they could lose their culture, lose their language. And that's what they did. Most of those that went to these schools lost the language, and when they came back, they could hardly talk or didn't even know it anymore because they were too young.
And not only that, when you're restricted, your lifestyle's changing, you're restricted, you can't go hunting. You're not supposed to go walking in the mountains. You're not supposed to go gather any food. You're not supposed to cross a white man's field out here to go get some medicine, to go have your ceremony, or you're not supposed to do it. You get no trespassing everywhere. Causes you to your whole spirit to atrophy. When your spirit atrophies, it gives up on your body, and your body deteriorates, and it turns very soft. And instead of running and climbing mountains and hunting and fishing and making baskets and gathering material, things like that, people are basically watch television sometimes and sometimes have a job, and a lot of times not have a job, but continue that very poor diet because we're left out of the economy. You know, we're left out of the economy chain. We're not supposed to have anything. We're not supposed to appreciate anything. We're not supposed to love each other. We're not supposed to have emotions. We're not supposed to, these things aren't supposed to, we're not supposed to have tender feelings. We're not supposed to have those things. We're supposed to be savage. We're supposed to be crude. We're supposed to be like a caveman mentality. And that's what they keep telling us. They keep telling our children. That's why I work with children. That's why you work with children. Because we've got to get that out of the textbooks, get that out of their thinking, get that out of their heart, and get that out of their mind, because their mind is very powerful.
I think it's real bad for all of us, all of you in this room, to see yourselves as victims of history. Once you put the mantle of victim on, you become helpless, and that's exactly the way the government has liked us. The reason they're so damn upset about the casinos is that suddenly you get Indians with money, and everybody's upset because they're so much more attractive when they're poor and helpless and dependent.
Remember Andrew Jackson? He said, annihilate the Indians from the face of the earth. See? But we're still here. We're so persistent. But that's what happened.
You cannot kill a people.
No,
spirit.
because
the spirit, the will to live is there.
And you know, when they said we want you to assimilate into the dominant society, we can't, because we have our own ways. We have our own religion. We can't join them. We can learn their language and do whatever they do, but we can't become a part of them. It's impossible.
Everybody has an umbilical cord attached to their mother, but you also have a spiritual umbilical cord, the ehlo. The ehlo attaches from where your belly button is to the center of the earth, to the center of the universe, and that's exactly where you're supposed to be, according to your ehlo. So they have this very strong ehlo. You could stretch it, but you couldn't break it.
I think the beautiful part of my history is, yes, my elders knew what they lost. They lost their homelands, they lost their culture, they lost their language, and everything they possibly ever dreamed of was gone. But yet they held on to the hope and believe that someday for their children, their grandchildren, their great-great-grandchildren, not yet born, there would be a better time, that the culture and everything that they lost would come back around and return. They believed in these things wholeheartedly. And I'm fortunate enough to see a small part of this come to pass and come true. That I have this heritage to pass down to the young people that I work with. So it's beautiful. And even what's happening right now, sitting in front of this camera, we'll be able to reach out to people in the far, dark areas of the world. And to be able to record the life and history of our elders. It's a beautiful prophecy that's coming to pass. And once again, Floyd, thank you for this opportunity.
One of the final acts of the Holocaust against Indians in the California story was the 1863 roundup and death march to the largest concentration camp in California, the Round Valley Reservation. Located in Northern California, this concentration camp was created to hold several Indian nations. They were the Yuki, Kankau-Maidu, Little Lake and Other Pomo, Nome Lackey, Cahote, Wailaki, and Pitt River. Whenever an Indian killed a white settler or miner, it created an excuse for militias to go down to the reservation and shoot any amount of Indians, including elders, women, and children, as retribution. This happened so often that Round Valley became known as the abattoir or the slaughter area. This overview is a contemporary picture of how the Holocaust still exists today. Indians have been decimated throughout history. They were left to languish in concentration camps while the rest of the country grew and prospered. Indians were being written off as roadkill cultures of manifest destiny. Before living in concentration camps, Indians had a perfect diet. In the concentration camps, they were forced to survive on government subsidies of flour, lard, sugar, salt, and canned meats. Often these meat products were contaminated. As a result of that diet, diabetes is prevalent in most Indian nations today. Today, Indians live with many forms of institutional racism. The movie industry continues to ridicule and stereotype Indians and their culture. While movies that denigrate African Americans and Hispanics are no longer there, those depicting Indian stereotypes can still be seen daily on television. This becomes a type of residual Holocaust that we live with today. Another form of residual Holocaust is racism in sports. Racism exists in all levels of sports today in their use of mascots. While there are no teams called Pittsburgh Negroes or New Jersey Jews, Indian people have to live with Washington Redskins, Cleveland Indians, Arcadia Apaches, and their insulting caricatures. Indians are further ignored as the rightful owners of this country. Having lost their culture and land, much like the victims of the Jewish Holocaust, Indians have lost their land and culture through the ruthless dominating efforts of America in the name of God, freedom, and democracy. Who will speak for the rightful owners of this land? When America goes to war with the nation and is victorious, it implements plans to help rebuild those defeated nations. Who will help rebuild the Indian nations that have been decimated and continue to exist in their present conditions? There is a moral challenge to the civilized world to address the issue of land and cultural retrieval for Indian people. There is a healing that needs to take place in America. America needs to heal from its violent past, or it will continue as it does today. In the aftermath of the Nazi Holocaust and World War II, German political leaders, military officers, and the German people were put on trial before the Nuremberg Tribunal. All were charged with war crimes, high crimes against humanity, and genocide, and all proclaimed their innocence. Military officers said they were only following orders. Political leaders and the German people proclaimed innocence by saying they had no idea what was going on in the concentration camps. To their protests of innocence, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson, who was the chief U.S. prosecutor at Nuremberg, responded to their protests of innocence by saying, "Certain acts and violations of treaties are crimes. They are crimes whether Germany commits them or whether the United States commits them. We are not prepared to impose a code of criminal conduct against others that we would not be willing to have invoked against us."